you ready? With your Bible to Easter calls below. What's happening in the world? Let's look at the Bible.
Good evening, everybody. Good. I hope you're having a very blessed evening. We are very blessed to have with us tonight Mike Poland once again. He's come to be with us, and we got a lot of great questions to ask him. But before we get started, I want to welcome all of you. If you're wherever you're watching this program, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to Are You Ready? Please share this video with as many people as possible. Thank you for joining us. And this is great information he's going to share. And if you have any question you would like to ask him, Mike Poland, tonight, please do so, and he'll do the best he can to answer your question. Once again, thank you for joining us here on Are You Ready? So before we get started, I mentioned his name, said his name, Mike Poland, but with the USGS, but I want him to explain, introduce himself, let people know who he is to those who are watching here on Are You Ready? Thank you for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure. My name's Mike Poland, and I'm a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and my specialty is actually in how volcanoes deform, how they move. So magma moving beneath the surface, fluids like hot water and gas, faulting, and how that translates to surface motion, then trying to relate that surface motion back to what's happening beneath the ground. I'm currently the scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, and I also do work in the Cascades from time to time as well.
Excellent. You're very busy, right? What you do.
We all are busy.
Absolutely. I've seen some of your videos that you've done. Very, very informative. Very informative. Thanks. Okay. Before we get started, because the majority of the program will be dealing with the volcanoes and eruptions around some of the places around the world. I want you, if you could, because I know there was a major earthquake in Mexico just a few days ago, 7.0, 7.1, and there was one which we thought there was. That's the information we received, that there was one in British Columbia, Canada. So if you could talk about first the one about Canada, because this is what I believed in. I thought people, and I even announced it on the program that there had been an earthquake in Canada and British Columbia. But then the information later came out that there was some sort of computer glitch of some kind. Could you explain to people what may have transpired?
Sure. Yeah, it's difficult to know for sure because I wasn't aware of this magnitude 6.5 in Canada, and I only sort of heard stories about it later on. So I'm sort of speculating as to what might happen. I mean, sometimes rumors start. I've seen people occasionally say things like, "Oh, there was a magnitude 8 in Yellowstone," which a lot of people would have felt that that wouldn't be something that just a few people knew. And same thing with the 6.5 in Canada. A lot of people would have felt that. So if it were a computer glitch, this does happen from time to time. Usually not that big an earthquake gets sort of glitched out, but all of the seismic computers that are used to sort of locate earthquakes have an automated system, and that's for rapidly detecting earthquakes and sending out warnings, both to seismologists and then in the case of the west coast of the U.S. right now, to residents. We have a system called Earthquake Early Warning. And it's meant to get information out as quickly as possible so people can take cover. So what might have happened is there could have been some strange signals recorded by seismometers, not necessarily earthquake related, but due to other things. We pick up everything on seismometers, sonic booms and people walking around, traffic, mine, quarry activity. So there's a lot of things that are recorded on seismometers. And sometimes they can occur in a way that will confuse the computer. And so the computer may pick an earthquake that never actually happened. I don't know if that's what actually occurred in this case, but it happens from time to time. You'll occasionally see earthquakes that are deleted from the record, and there'll be a note that says this was not an actual earthquake. The computer basically didn't didn't know what it was looking at. And this, I think, underscores the importance of having seismologists, people that are really trained to look at earthquakes, review all of these data sets and make sure that what the computer is picking is actually an earthquake. So for an earthquake like that, there would be sort of a 24/7 response to something that size in Canada, in the US, any place where seismologists were sort of watching for those sorts of big events.
So just not to linger too much on this one. So could, you said a sonic boom could cause something like that? Could an explosion trigger something that it felt like it was an earthquake? Could that happen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's anything that will vibrate the ground will create earthquakes, earthquake noise, seismic noise. It'll be recorded on a seismometer. Wind can do that. So we actually see storms all the time on seismometers. An explosion would. We can use seismometers actually to locate nuclear tests that maybe are done. In fact, this is the way that a lot of the nuclear tests in North Korea have been detected. And the size of the explosion can be detected through the amount of shaking that's recorded on seismometers. Now, nothing is a 6.5. A sonic boom, we can see those in seismometers. It wouldn't create a 6.5, but if something like that happened, it might have confused the computer if it happened in just the right way. You know, one of those sort of rare things where everything conspires to really confuse the computer. But I don't know that that's the case, but that can happen from time to time. Other times, you know, they're just weird rumors that are started.
Spread, right?
Yeah.
Because when you get to an earthquake of a 6, and those are mega, right? Am I correct? Those are considered mega earthquakes?
Well, at 6, I wouldn't say is quite like the mega level. That's what we're getting up to, like, you know, 8s and 9s. But a 6 is definitely a strong event. I mean, if it were a 6, it would have been felt by many, many people. And it has the potential to cause damage. So a magnitude 6.5 is nothing to sneeze at. If that had been real, it would have, depending on where it occurred and when it occurred, it would have the potential to cause some damage.
Okay. All right. Now, the one now in Mexico, now that was definitely a very strong earthquake, right? It was 6. Now, a question regarding that, because I want to know how the USGS determines. Because first it was determined it was to be a 7.4, and then it was brought down to a 7.1 or 7.0. How do you determine, why do you lower it? Why do you sometimes you keep it? How do you do that?
So all of these earthquakes that occur are reviewed by trained seismologists. And the more stations that record an earthquake, the better the magnitude you can get. So of course, there's a very real need to have an estimate on the magnitude as quickly as possible, right? Okay. Because this can give you a sense of whether or not it's going to be a very damaging event, whether or not, you know, first responders should be notified to get into certain areas. And so there's always a first magnitude that comes out usually within minutes of the earthquake. And that's not based on all of the data. That's based on just what's available at the time. And so typically what happens is there's that initial estimate that sort of gets out there for, you know, public information. There was a strong earthquake in this certain area, a magnitude about, say, 7.4. But the more data that you can look at, the more you can refine that number. And so you'll even see sometimes days later, the magnitude will be refined, because seismologists can, for the very largest earthquakes, seismologists can look at data from around the world, because those big earthquakes are recorded worldwide. So it's part art and it's part science, that you need to get as much data as possible and then pick all of the earthquake arrivals and their sizes on every seismometer you can. And when you do that, you can come to a very accurate magnitude determination, but that can take some time. So there's sort of the preliminary one, and then there's an adjustment. And sometimes it's adjusted up, sometimes it's adjusted down.
Now, does the European, do they have their own system of seismology as the USGS, correct?
Well, typically, every country sort of runs their own seismic network. And some countries share their data. So, for example, all of the seismic stations in the United States are available. some countries don't share their data. And so this is a challenge with locating earthquakes that happen outside of the US.
Okay.
So, if a country is not sharing its data, then we only have stations in the United States, which are open. And then there's a network that's international called the International Seismic Network.
Okay.
And that all of the data from the International Seismic Network are public, and those are freely available. But if there aren't several of those stations near where the earthquake happens, you don't get a very good record. And so sometimes if the earthquake occurs quite far away and it's not recorded by instruments that, for example, USGS scientists have access to, then they won't get a good location or a good magnitude. Whereas the host country will have a pretty good magnitude. So for anything very big, you can pretty much look at any catalog, and
Okay.
you'll have very solid numbers because anything big will be recorded worldwide. For something very small, magnitudes 3s, 4s,
Right.
I would advise looking at the seismic network in the country where the earthquake occurred. So, for example, if there's an earthquake in Canada, a magnitude 4 earthquake in Canada, look at the Canadian seismic network. Don't look at the USGS, because the data that the USGS has access to is not going to be the same as the data that the Canadians have access to.
Got it. So whatever the Canadians, so suppose hypothetically, if the Canadians had an earthquake 4.0,
Mhm.
but or they say 4.5, we here USGS says no, it's 4.0. We should believe the 4.5. Is that
Well,
what you're saying?
Yeah, typically what would happen is that, after the event occurs and there's a little bit of time has passed, then the seismologists would compare data and come up with sort of an official magnitude for that event. But every area, and this is true within the United States as well, every area has an authoritative agency. So in the United States, the USGS is the authoritative agency, but within the US, there are much smaller groups that have authoritative responsibility. So, for example, in Yellowstone, the University of Utah is the authoritative agency for locating earthquakes. And they're the ones that locate the earthquakes, and then they send all of their information to the USGS into the catalog. So in Canada, the USGS is sort of using the data that they have access to locate an earthquake there. But the authoritative location and magnitude will come from the Canadian
whatever the country is.
Exactly. So the data that the USGS have would not be complete. And it would only happen after the fact that sort of the seismologists get together and try to refine things to get the best possible magnitude. But that's one of the challenges we face, is that some places all the data are accessible. In other places, the data aren't accessible, and so you can only use what's available.
Right.
So if it's a smaller earthquake, it's harder to locate. The big events are recorded by these international stations, and those anyone can get to.
Okay. One more question regarding earthquakes.
Sure.
What determines, because I know sometimes you hear of a swarm.
Uh-huh.
It's a swarm of earthquakes. What causes, is there a reason that could cause a swarm of earthquakes on a certain place, location?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of reasons for swarms now, and we should distinguish between a swarm of earthquakes, which is sort of a whole bunch of just low-level earthquakes,
Right.
and an aftershock sequence. In
Correct.
an aftershock sequence, there's one strong earthquake, and then after that strong earthquake happens, the whole fault system is having to readjust. It's sort of like, if a piece of wood breaks, it might continue to crackle after it breaks as the remaining wood sort of adjusts to the break. So a good example, I think, is in March of 2020, there was a magnitude 6.5 in central Idaho.
Okay.
And there have been lots and lots of earthquakes in central Idaho ever since. Now, those are aftershocks. So that big earthquake happened, it sort of broke the rock in that area, and everything is readjusting. But over time, those earthquakes sort of peter out. They get less and less over time. So that's an aftershock sequence.
Okay.
A swarm in a place like Yellowstone
Right.
can be caused by magma moving, can be caused by water moving, and it can be caused by faults that move just a little bit. Instead of in a big event, they just sort of creep along and pop as they go.
Okay.
And those swarms are defined by lots of smallish earthquakes, magnitudes 0, 1, 2, 3, that happen in the same place in rapid succession. So you might have dozens of earthquakes or many more in an hour or two, or sometimes it may be spread over days, sometimes months. And depending on the character of that earthquake or that sequence of earthquakes, we can tell whether or not it's likely to be related to magma or water or gas or fault movement.
Okay. So thank you for sharing that, because that's important differences between a swarm and an aftershocks.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's get started here. Okay. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is the one that you emailed me on, is the one that I heard about Yellowstone supervolcano, that there was a 60% chance. Now, this is what, and I'm sure you're going to explain, why this idea or rumor has occurred. A 60% chance of Yellowstone erupting in 2022 or in 2023. And please, could you explain what do you think about that?
Well, it's hogwash.
All right, there you go.
There's we can't say, there's no, well, it's, if there's any chance of an eruption at all, which I would put the chance much closer to zero.
All right.
It's not 60. The magma chamber at Yellowstone is mostly solid. And until we see a rejuvenation, some sort of input that would start to melt the magma chamber to generate more eruptible magma, Yellowstone doesn't really have the capacity to do that much. Okay. So I heard, you'd mentioned this, and I hadn't heard this. So I started doing some research and found that it showed up on some YouTube page somewhere that there's and I saw all kinds of variations on it. Like there's a person who's leaking information from the Pentagon. Right. No, it wasn't the Pentagon. It was the, something. And it's just silly. There's no chance of Yellowstone. There's 60%. No, that's completely made up. What I have noted over the last few months is that I think Yellowstone misinformation, Yellowstone kind of fear mongering, these sorts of videos that you can see online, the word is out that will attract viewers. And a lot of these YouTube channels have advertisements in them. This is a way that some of these people that make the content also make money. And I don't have a problem with people making money, but it's kind of sad when it relies on putting out false information like that. So it seems to me that people are starting to realize, some of these people that make this content, that people are interested in Yellowstone and they'll click on those videos. And so they sort of have to make them attractive to watch, right? So, hey, there's an anonymous source from the Pentagon who said that Yellowstone had a 60% chance of erupting. And I think that's interesting too. 60% chance of erupting. That means there's a 40% chance it won't erupt, right? So when it doesn't happen in 2022 or 2023, whoever leaked this will just say, well, there was a 40%
chance.
It's almost 50-50, right? I mean, so if it doesn't happen, it's not really a surprise.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's actually very clever of whoever made this up. They gave themselves a very nice big door to walk through at the end.
A way of escape there, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's an escape hatch for them.
Exactly, an escape hatch. All right, here we go. Okay, let's start here. Let's start with Yellowstone.
Sure.
Is there anything at this moment, anything you have seen unusual in the last few weeks, last few months, since we last spoke? Anything unusual?
Well, there have been a lot of earthquakes. Now, that's not unusual in itself. Yellowstone has lots of earthquakes, but we had this really nice calm year up to June. And then June, we started seeing a few more swarms. And in July, there was a really big swarm. There were hundreds of earthquakes in mid-July that happened underneath Yellowstone Lake.
Okay.
And so we went from having sort of a very quiet year to having sort of a normal year in terms of overall earthquakes. But a lot of those earthquakes occurred right there, especially in July. There were over 1,000 earthquakes that were located in July. Now, that's not a record. We had over 1,100 earthquakes were located in June of 2017. So that's only 4 years ago, right?
All right.
But summertime can be a very active time in Yellowstone in terms of earthquakes. And that's because a lot of these earthquakes are triggered by water that's percolating down from the surface. So Yellowstone gets a tremendous amount of snow. On average, it's the highest area of the Rockies. And so it gets a tremendous amount of snow. That snow melts and it gradually percolates into the subsurface where it starts lubricating faults. It basically can pump up the pressure on the faults, sort of like, pumping up a sponge. And eventually those faults start to slip. And so we tend to see some of the biggest seismic swarms during summer months. The last really big seismic swarm, over 2,400 earthquakes, was June, July, August, and into September of 2017. And so it's sort of water and faults. When you mix those two together, you're going to get lots of small earthquakes. So that's most likely what's happening with these swarms that sort of popped up in June and July. But we having a very nice quiet year in Yellowstone. And then we had the burst of seismicity, which, not unusual at all, but it certainly disrupted the nice quiet year.
Okay. So it'd be nothing else on you strange.
Yellowstone is continuing to subside. So the caldera is actually sinking. That's been going on since 2015, but sometimes it goes up. Now, before 2015, it went up for a year. It had gone down from 2010 to 2014. It was going up from 2004 to 2009. So the whole floor of the caldera rises and falls at a rate of just an inch or two a year. So very small. But it's been subsiding since 2015. And we didn't see any changes in deformation during these earthquake swarms. So all of this earthquake activity didn't even really affect what the surface was doing. Haven't really seen many other changes. Some people might be aware of Steamboat Geyser. That's the tallest geyser in the world. And I think we talked about that last time. That one's slowing down. And that's sort of to be expected too. Some of these geysers go through phases of being very active and then sort of very quiet. And so we always knew that at some point Steamboat would get out of this very active phase it's in. And that appears to be happening right now, which is kind of a bummer because it's a spectacular sight to see. And it's sort of disappointing to think that it won't be quite as common as it has been over the last 3 years.
And that's something that people, when they do, they like to see them.
Oh man, yeah, it's unforgettable when you see it. It is just incredible. And I've there's a lot of videos online you can tune into where people watch Steamboat going off, and the cheers of the people that are standing there watching it. It's really fun to watch because you can sort of sense the excitement of everybody that's standing there on the boardwalk.
Excellent. All right. Now, there are 3 volcanoes, and this is what I heard, in Alaska.
Yes.
Now, and I also heard something else, because I'll talk about that afterwards, but there are 3 volcanoes in Alaska, they say, at the point of erupting. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. So Alaska is the most volcanically active area in the U.S. There are dozens of volcanoes up there. There's about 50 that have erupted in the last, 250 years or so. Wow. And some of them are really active. They're sort of almost always erupting. So there's 3 of them right now that are erupting or right on the verge of erupting. There's one called Great Sitkin, which has a really nice lava flow that's been coming out of it. Really impressive. There's another one called Semisapuchnoi, and that one has been putting out these ash plumes. And then another one called Pavlov. Yeah, I got that one. One of the most active in Alaska, and that's been acting up as well. That's all sort of normal for Alaska, where eruptions are pretty common. There's usually several eruptions a year. Yeah, so Alaska, if you want to go see volcanoes, Alaska's the place to go. But most of them are way out in the Aleutians. So fortunately, not that close to large population centers.
Okay, I don't know if you heard about a gentleman named Chris Wade Thomas.
Wade Thomas, yes. Yeah, I know Chris.
It spoke about open system volcano. What's an open system volcano?
An open system volcano would be sort of like a faucet that's turned on. You can imagine you have a faucet that's turned off and on, and a volcano can turn off and on, go dormant for a while and turn on when the spigot's turned on. Right. Well, an open vent volcano would be like a faucet that's sort of always on, at least always dribbling. So there are a few volcanoes in Alaska and around the world that we call them open vent volcanoes. Oops, sorry, my light just went out. There are a few volcanoes in Alaska that are open vent volcanoes, and they're always sort of doing something. Shishaldin is one. Cleveland is another. In fact, Cleveland, I think the color code was raised up to yellow recently on Cleveland. So Cleveland is starting to act up. But Cleveland is almost always erupting. So I think that's what Chris was referring to, is some of these volcanoes that are sort of always erupting because there's always magma pretty close to the surface.
Okay, so you mentioned that how does the color codes of volcanoes, who, first of all, what are they? And then who determines what color code to switch them to?
So the color codes are something the USGS established several years ago to sort of give an at-a-glance look at whether or not a volcano is doing something hazardous. And it's very important for the aviation community because, some of these volcanoes are way out in the Aleutians and, not around people. There's no people living on the islands, but there are a lot of airplanes that fly over the tops of these volcanoes, and airplanes and ash don't mix. So if there was ever an eruption in one of these places, you want the planes to go around the ash plumes. So it's meant to sort of provide an at-a-glance look at the sort of hazards that might be experienced to aviation and then to ground-based hazards as well. Typically, the volcano observatories around the world will have these sorts of codes. One of the challenges I think we have internationally is that they're not standardized. So, in Indonesia, they have a system that's not the same as in the Philippines, as in Japan, as in the United States, as in Italy. So the color code in the US is unique to the US. And those are just green, which is normal background activity. Yellow, which is, there's a little bit going on that's not background. Something's going on. Low-level seismicity, perhaps some ground deformation that's uplift, that's might be suggesting an eruption, something, magma's moving around. Orange means that there's either an eruption happening that's not hazardous. So some of these eruptions in Alaska are only putting out very small bits of ash or lava flows, which aren't particularly hazardous. Or it's a volcano that might be about to have an explosive eruption sometime soon. And then red is if there's a large explosive eruption happening or some other very hazardous activity. So red eruptions are ones that can put ash up to the flight level of jet airliners, or doing something very hazardous on the ground, very large lava flows spilling into populated areas, for example. And all the color codes in the US are set by the responsible volcano observatory. So in Alaska, the Alaska Volcano Observatory. In Hawaii, the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, like that.
Okay. Now, let's say how much time, let's say hypothetically, one of these volcanoes is about to hit you give them a red.
Yeah.
How much time do people have to evacuate these volcanoes? Because there could be a volcano that could be near where people are living. Some people live near volcanoes.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I know it's a great sight to see, but there's always that one time. So how much time do they have? How much time do you guys to notify the place to evacuate?
Well, this is one of the reasons. This is one of the advantages we have with volcanoes. So a lot of natural hazards, like say earthquakes, it just happens, right? There's no real warning. With volcanoes, they give warnings. Volcanoes have rising levels of seismicity. Maybe the ground starts to uplift. The composition of the gases coming out will change. Maybe there'll be a thermal anomaly. We can detect that from space using satellites. So that sort of activity will be a sign that something's going on. And in the USGS, we have very strong ties with civil defense officials. So so occasionally I get people asking me like, well, when, what would you ever evacuate anyone? That's not what the USGS does. We are not experts in urban planning or civil defense. We're experts in volcanoes. We leave the decisions about what to do to the experts, the civil planners and the civil protection folks. So we communicate what's happening at the volcano, what we think is going to happen in the future to civil defense officials. And then they make decisions about whether or not evacuations should be made. Now, the larger the eruption at quiet volcanoes, the larger the eruption that it eventually is, the longer the lead time. That's sort of a general rule in volcanology. So the more activity we see, the more building we see, the more we can give that kind of warning to the local emergency managers. But it's critical that the volcanoes be monitored so that we can see the signs before they become really alarming. So we can see the low level signs of a volcano waking up. You don't want to, we have a saying, you don't want to play catch up with the volcano. You want to be right there watching it as it's waking up, not running to the volcano with your instrument. It's when it's already stirring and an eruption is brewing.
So in other words, you don't want to wait to the last minute to do something.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, we want to have our equipment and our monitoring in place beforehand. So even though, let's say, Mount Rainier is quiet right now, we want to have it wired. We want to have it really wired well so that if it starts to just stir, we'll detect it. And that'll give us some really valuable lead time.
Right. You don't want to wait to the last minute. Like
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
So your job is to get that information and give it to civil defense. They then decide what they're going to do with that information.
That's right.
Do you guys, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you guys give any recommendation? Because you can say, well, this is what this volcano is doing right now. Or do you say, it's bad. It's bad. I mean, it's about to go. It's about to go.
Yeah, and we can say, so this volcano, it looks like it's about to erupt. If it erupts, our information based on the geologic history of the volcano is that, let's take Mount Rainier as an example, is that ash plumes are not really a big deal at Rainier, but eruptions from Rainier can generate a lot of snowmelt and ice melt because there's a ton of snow and ice on that mountain, and that can create mud flows. And the mud flows will go down rivers, and they could, damage houses or any communities that are in the river valleys. And so, in our expert opinion, the great hazard is to low-lying river valleys around Rainier because an eruption looks like it's imminent, and that could generate a lot of snowmelt. And that's the information we provide. And we can even give hazard maps. That's one of the things we do in advance is we create simulations of what an eruption might look like. And so that the emergency managers then have a map and they can say, with a medium-sized eruption, it looks like these places would be impacted. So we want to evacuate these places. With a large eruption, we'd want to expand the evacuation zone. And that's something we can then say, well, we believe this is going to be a large eruption based on all the seismicity, the deformation, the gas, and so forth.
So
it's a real tight collaboration.
So I like what you guys do give them, like you say, scenarios of what could happen depending on the size of the eruption.
Exactly. And we actually, this is something we practice. So we don't just sort of sit around waiting for something to happen. We will get together and have exercises where we simulate what an eruption might look like, whether it's Mount Rainier or Mount Baker or Kilauea or Redoubt in Alaska, whatever. We'll simulate an eruption and then sort of have a scenario. And then we'll sort of stop the scenario and say, okay, what decisions are you going to make? And that gives us a way to sort of play at what a real eruption would look like. And it allows us to find the problems. Like, wait a minute, we don't have a way of communicating directly with a certain county that we want to inform. Who's the emergency manager in this particular county? And so then you can find those weak points, those weak links, and you can strengthen them. And so when it's showtime, when you really have to do it for real, you've already practiced it. And so
you're prepared.
You're prepared. And all of these things that might come up, all of these problems, you've already encountered them when you've done the simulation. So we not only do the monitoring and do the mapping of hazards, we also do sort of these simulations so that we'll be ready. When it does happen, we're not sort of thinking like, oh, geez, who do I call? We know exactly what to do.
Exactly. That's excellent. That's good that so people, you're not surprised you've been preparing for such an event.
Yeah, and in fact, for many people that live in zones that are hazard zones for volcanoes, they have these little simulations they do as well. There are communities around Mount Rainier that are in the paths of potential future mudflows, and they have practice evacuation drills. So just like, earthquake drills, Some people that live around volcanoes, they have volcano drills.
Volcano drills to be prepared, right?
Exactly.
For that one time, right?
Yeah.
That could happen. That could happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when it happens, you want to have thought about what you're going to do and be ready, and then you can act. You can get that plan of action going and get yourself to safety, and that goes for sort of everyone all the way along that chain of providing information. Everyone has a job to do, and they know what to do, and they do it, and that's the way we're going to make sure that people can be safe during these hazardous events.
And you're not caught off guard.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the goal, is that we don't want to be caught off guard with the monitoring. We don't want to be caught off guard with the preparedness.
Okay, let's talk now. I want to talk about a little bit about Hawaii.
Sure.
Big Island, Hawaii. Is that where Kilauea is on Big Island?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah. Kilauea is it's on the south part of the Big Island.
Now, tell us a little bit about the activity of Kilauea and anything new with it recently.
Well, I could talk a lot about this. I was based in Hawaii for 10 years, and I worked on Kilauea, and it was one of the most exciting times in my career because Kilauea is one of the most active volcanoes on the planet. It's always doing something. Okay. Fortunately, usually the activity goes into places that aren't populated. And so it's almost like a tourist volcano. You can go up and see lava and feel earth shaking and so forth. But every now and then there are strong earthquakes. There can be magnitude 7s. There can even be a magnitude 8. We think there was a magnitude 8 back in 1868. There was a magnitude 7.7 in 1975. So there are strong earthquakes that you need to be ready for. But occasionally there are eruptions that send lava into populated areas. And there was a really big eruption in 2018 that destroyed over 700 homes. It really redid the map of the especially tip of the island. When that happened, so much lava came out that it took a while for the volcano to refill itself. So basically, Kilauea burped out a huge amount of lava, and it was kind of empty. And so it had this period of about 2.5 years where it was refilling. We could see it refilling because there was earthquake activity and uplift of the ground. And we could tie that uplift back to the magma chamber. So we knew it was refilling. And then in December of 2020, it finally filled enough to where it could have an eruption. And it had a small eruption at the summit that lasted until May. It was sort of a lava lake eruption. Lava erupted on the side of this crater, and it just filled the crater with lava. It was a wonderful eruption for scientists because it didn't harm anyone. The biggest hazard was some gas that affected other people. But in terms of hazard, aside from the gas, it was a wonderful science eruption. We could study this and learn from it. In the last few weeks, just at the end of August, there was another intrusion beneath the south part of Kilauea caldera, which is the crater at the top. So magma basically squirted into a new spot that was about a mile or so deep, and it caused the ground to pop up. And that was something that we were able to see with various sensors we have put around the volcano. It created a lot of earthquakes. And so those sorts of intrusions happen at Kilauea pretty often, where magma is sort of squirting around underground. And then we can track it, though, by looking at earthquakes and ground deformation. So that's what happened then. And it squirted into this area of the volcano where it's actually done it several times before. In 2015 was the last time. But eruptions in that part of the area are pretty rare. I think the last eruption was 1974. So for some reason, that particular part of the volcano, it likes to get little squirts of magma underground, but rarely does it ever make it to the surface. But Kilauea won't stay quiet for long. It is a very active volcano. It's almost one of these open vent volcanoes where the spigot is on. There's always magma coming in, and pressure is going to build to the point where it'll have to pop out at some point. So there will be eruptions in the future, perhaps within the next few months. They're likely to be at the summit, though, and fortunately, no one lives at the summit.
Now, when it comes to percentage, what would you say with the percentage of Kilauea erupting?
Oh, like the odds of it erupting in the next year? Geez, I put it near 100%.
Really, near 100%.
I mean, because that volcano is just always active. You can imagine a volcano is sort of like the interface between the magma chamber below and the ground, right? Well, the magma chamber at Kilauea is always getting magma. So the deep supply is on. And that's building pressure within the volcano. And when that pressure gets to the point that it breaks the rock, breaks the container, pops the balloon, say, then the magma has to move someplace. Now, like in August, it could move to the side and just sort of squirt out to the side. That's what happened in August and not erupt. Or it could move upwards and give us an eruption at the summit. And so that's what happened back in December of 2020 is it moved up. We had a nice summit eruption. In August, it moved to the side. We had one of these intrusions that didn't erupt. So I'd say, within the next few months, we'll see something like that again, because that spigot is always on. And it'll either squirt out to the side again and not erupt, or it'll pop up to the surface. So yeah, within the next year, I'd say there's pretty much 100% chance of something happening.
Something happening, Kilauea.
And it could easily be an eruption. Typically, now that we're in this cycle of eruptive activity, we'll see eruptions every few months or so.
Now, you mentioned one, Kilauea, in 1974. Now, that one, what's different what you're talking about now to the one in 1974?
Not too much different. So that one just popped out of the ground, and it erupted for, I think, only a few days. Sent some lava flows that headed down towards the coast, but it was all in the national park in an area that was unpopulated. So fortunately, much of the area that Kilauea sits on near the summit is a national park, and no one lives there.
No one lives there.
So that's a good thing. In the 2018, unfortunately, the eruption moved way down slope, and it actually popped up in people's front yards. So that was really, really tragic that it happened there. But that's one of the things that can occasionally happen on Kilauea. Now, fortunately, the monitoring network was in place that you could actually see the magma going underground all the way down. It went like 25 miles underground before it popped out. And it popped out basically in people's backyards. But this was something that we were tracking. The Hawaiian Volcano Observatory was able to issue some warnings that said, be aware, this looks like this might culminate in an eruption in a subdivision. And that's exactly what happened.
So there was enough time for people to evacuate, correct? Yeah.
Now that's one of the good things about Kilauea is that it doesn't usually, it can have big explosive eruptions, but it doesn't normally have them. And when it has these trains of seismicity where magma is squirting along under the ground and then it pops out, they tend to be very sort of low-level eruptions. They may eventually build into really large lava flows, but they're the kinds of things that you can walk away from. Okay. And when lava is coming out of vents in your backyard, you don't really need to be told to evacuate. You leave. Right. So it's when the eruption sort of persists for a while, and if it looks like lava may be going into populated areas, then you would see the Hawaii County Civil Defense issuing warnings about, all right, this area may be threatened next.
Correct.
People, please be aware. We may have to call for an evacuation in the future if the lava flow activity continues.
And you need to move out,
right?
Immediately.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. You mentioned that. Let me see. Okay. Here's one. How long can a volcano remain dormant?
Oh, goodness. Thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
There are volcanoes that have been quiet. Every now and then one will erupt and sort of take us by surprise because it hadn't shown any previous signs of activity. Okay. A good example is Pinatubo in the Philippines. That had one of the largest eruptions of the 20th century in 1991. Yes. But the previous eruption was prehistoric. It was hundreds of years previous. And so there was no record. There's no real local knowledge that Pinatubo was this active volcano. And it wasn't until later that scientists looked at it and said, oh, geez, we see eruptive deposits that are hundreds of years old. So, volcanoes can occasionally go quiet for thousands of years. There's volcanoes in the Cascades that haven't erupted in thousands of years. Mount Shasta looks like it probably hasn't had an eruption in hundreds to thousands of years. So, but it will erupt again one day. And that's why being, even though... Yeah, we can't get complacent, right? We can't sort of go to sleep on it because we need to make sure we're there to detect any stirring that might sort of accompany the reawakening of one of these volcanoes.
Because if it does, if you don't do that, then you don't have enough time to prepare people to
Exactly.
evacuate.
Then you're playing catch up, and you don't want to play catch up with a volcano.
Then you don't have time. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, you mentioned that. Okay. Okay, and I think you mentioned, I want you to go over it one more time.
Sure.
You mentioned and you said it before we finish the program tonight, the colors of the colors of the volcanoes, the
alert level codes.
The alert levels, right. And then where can one see, would they see them at the USGS website? Is that where they find the color levels?
So if you go to volcanoes.usgs.gov, you'll be able to see the very first thing that pops up is a map of the entire volcanic area of the U.S., which is basically the western U.S., all the way out to the Marianas Islands in the Pacific Ocean, near Guam. That's a U.S. territory.
Okay.
And so those are volcanoes as well. And we monitor those also. So you can see at a glance the volcanoes that are green, yellow, orange, and any that are red. Okay. And there's also something we have that's called the Volcano Notification Service. And you can link to it off of that same page, volcanoes.usgs.gov. Okay. And you can sign up to get email notifications whenever a color code changes. And you could fix it to be just Alaska or just the Cascades or all volcanoes in the United States. You can sort of customize the alerts that you want.
Wow, that's fantastic. So people can know what's happening around the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. At least around the U.S. volcanoes.
Right. Now, there was something I heard, I didn't mention it earlier. There's some scientists that came out recently, and they said that they believe that several super volcanoes were about to erupt. I don't know if you've heard that.
I have, and
an article that came out recently.
Yeah, I had to do some digging on this as well to try to understand. Wait a minute, and you might be familiar with the sort of the children's game of telephone.
Yes.
Where you tell one person one thing, and by the time it reaches the end, it doesn't even resemble what it started as. I think this is a game of telephone. So what happened was these scientists published some work about a large volcano in Indonesia called Toba. Toba had a huge eruption, bigger than Yellowstone, 74,000 years ago.
Okay.
And they looked at some of the lava that came out and saw that it came out as a very sort of cool lava, and it looked like it how did this stuff even erupt? And so they were speculating that there might be eruptions at these volcanoes, even though the magma content is very low.
Okay.
Now, they weren't speculating about big explosive events, but this is that game of telephone, right? And suddenly, the super volcano name, and unfortunately, that's one of the things I don't like about the super volcano term, is that some people think that the only eruption you can get from a volcano like that is a big explosion. In fact, lava flows are way more common. And so they were really studying lava flow eruptions at some of these types of volcanoes, but the telephone game turned it into, oh my goodness, there's a bunch of volcanoes that are about to erupt.
It's about to go.
Yeah. So, and this sort of thing happens pretty often when there are scientific articles that come out about some of these big volcanoes, because they're amazing. They're super interesting.
Right.
And, people start, every time the story gets retold, it changes just a little. And sometimes I can give you an example of how this happened to me. There was a study that looked at some Yellowstone lava flows, and they suggested that there might be only decades of rejuvenation before one of these eruptions, these lava flow eruptions, would happen. So instead of being thousands of years to rejuvenate a magma chamber, maybe it's decades, and there's still some debate about that. But that happened, and within about 24 hours, it went from, this was in 2017, the story went from, well, it might be that, some of these lava flow eruptions might take decades to sort of get ready to go, to Yellowstone is going to explode by 2030. And what was very funny is I was actually in Yellowstone at the time working, and I drove into the park, and there's no cell coverage in the park except in a couple places. I drove into the park to do my work, and I went in knowing that this story had just come out. And when I drove out of the park that night, and I suddenly, my email went berserk, my phone went berserk, because there were all these stories all of a sudden. Yellowstone is going to erupt within 10 years.
Wow. So then,
that's like,
for one story, it just became huge.
Yeah. And I actually tried to track it down. And for a while, I had a sort of like, okay, there was this article, and then this article, and then this article. And every single time it changed just a bit. Yellowstone lava flows might rejuvenate in decades. And then it became, well, Yellowstone might erupt within decades. Yellowstone might explode within decades. Yellowstone might explode within a decade. Yellowstone will erupt by 2030.
Yeah, that's how usually the telephone game goes, doesn't it?
It was funny, except that, of course, people saw this and they were alarmed, rightly so. Sure. And I think that sort of shows the danger of, some of and these were very legitimate, media outlets that were getting this story wrong. So it really shows how it's important to, that the media really needs to put in the time and effort to get the story right.
Correct.
And it's, it's hard work, but, if you get it wrong, then you end up, putting out a lot of people. Exactly. I do get contacted from people that have real anxiety about Yellowstone. They see stories like that, or they see these crazy YouTube videos that claim, 60% eruption or whatever. And they are scared. They can't sleep. And so I have to do my best to try to explain, this information is not accurate. So yeah, it really, unfortunately, when people put that kind of thing out there, whether they're on YouTube or whether in the New York Times, it really is a disservice to the people.
Do you get people, when they get these stories, do they try to contact you and see what you say about it before they print stuff?
Yeah, sometimes I'll say, like, would you like to comment on this? And that's good, because then it gives me an opportunity to say, well, I think you might need to do a little bit more research about this. Or I can also say, here are some people you should talk to. And in fact, what I find sort of puzzling is that a lot of times an article will come out, so the authors of a research paper will talk with a reporter from wherever. And then other people, other agencies, newspapers, TV, whatever, will do their own reports based on that first report, but they'll never talk to the scientists. They'll never call up the scientists that did the actual work and say, we'd like to get your comment on this. We want to make sure we understand this. And so I really respect it when I see people from the media calling the scientists that did the work and not just believing what showed up, in somebody else's newspaper, right?
Right. That's the right thing.
It amazes me that, you would sort of publish something without talking to that original source.
Yeah, so, I think that's the proper thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, before we finish tonight, and we have been blessed with having you here with all that great information you have shared. And what would you want before we finish tonight? What would you like the people to remember of all that we've spoken about? What would you like them to think about? Think about and keep in mind.
Well, I think there is a lot of questionable information out there, and it can be hard to tell the good from the bad. And I also know that, hey, I work for the government, and I know it can be hard to trust government. I feel that way myself sometimes. Mm-hmm. So I think the take-home message I would give is for everyone to apply some common sense. Okay. So, for example, that magnitude 6.5 earthquake in Canada that I saw some people say, well, it was there and then it was erased because somebody doesn't want you to know. Well, could a 6.5 earthquake happen and be completely missed by Canada, by people that live in British Columbia? Of course not. That would be felt all over the place.
Correct.
Similar thing with Yellowstone. Occasionally I see people say, well, you're not reporting all the earthquakes. There's much stronger earthquakes happening. Well, you can't hide an earthquake. There's thousands of people that live all around Yellowstone and work in Yellowstone. There's tens of thousands of tourists there on any given day. And if there's a magnitude 4 earthquake, say, in Yellowstone, there's going to be a lot of people that feel it.
Who's going to feel it?
I think the way scientists think is they think skeptically. Whenever we see something, we always question, say, all right, let's think about this and try to decide whether or not it really could be. And so I guess I would encourage people to, you don't have to believe me, you don't have to believe YouTube, but just apply some common sense and think about what you're seeing and then, kind of ask some questions. Be skeptical. And I think if you're skeptical and have that sort of common sense filter, you'll arrive at good information.
Excellent. Well, Mike, I want to thank you for being with us. And we're glad to have had Mike Poland with us here on Are You Ready?
My
I hope
pleasure.
all of you who have watched, thank you for being with us. Thank you very much. And please, if you have watched this video and if you do see it, please subscribe and please share it with as many people as possible. This is great information that we know. And I think one of the things we need to have is to have discernment and observe, and we need to do our own research to find out the things that we hear so that we don't get all frightened. Okay. So thank you, Mike Poland.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us on Are You Ready? And everybody, I hope you have a very blessed evening, safe evening, and don't forget, subscribe. Thank you, Mike. I hope you have a very blessed evening.
You as well.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.